Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
The idea of compatibilism. When I was a Calvinist, I couldn't accept the notion that God determines evil. And so I believed in compatibilism. That yes, God does determine all things that come to pass, but that is compatible with human responsibility by means of secondary causes. Our desires. God doesn't determine our actions, He determines the desires behind our actions. And that is compatible with human responsibility, because ultimately we are doing what we desire to do, even though our desires are determined. I like to think of the analogy of a pool player striking the cue ball to hit the 8-ball in the corner pocket. The pool player representing God, the cue ball representing our desires, and the 8-ball representing our sin. Now, if the player strikes the cue ball and sinks the 8-ball in the corner pocket, we all intuitively know who is credited with winning the game. It's the pool player, not the cue ball. But yet, on compatibilism, the cue ball, our desires, are credited with the responsibility of our actions. And the problem is that just doesn't work in real life. It's not tenable unless people start giving credit to cue balls for winning games. Being free to do what you want to do according to your greatest desire is not free will if God determines your desires. It's not free will. Okay, we all know if a man walks into a bar and grabs the nearest woman that he sees and throws her over his shoulder and runs out of the bar and takes her back to his house and rapes her against her will, that man is responsible for the crime that he committed, obviously. But what compatibilism is saying is that if that same man walked into that bar and put a potion in that woman's drink, that the first person that she looks at after she drinks it will become madly in love with him and will desire to go with him and do whatever he wants to do. And she drinks the potion and she looks at the man and she walks out with him and spends the night with him. The desires that she had that night were given to her, were caused by that man. And no one, and intuitively we know, no one would say that that woman is responsible for what happened to her. And yet on compatibilism, the woman is responsible for going with that man who she doesn't know because she desired to go with him, but those desires were not her own. I heard it said in a quote, compatibilism is true only in the sense that a puppet is free as long as it loves its strings. And as far as I can tell, that makes God responsible for sin. But we know that pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world. Not to mention that pride and lust are desires. And I was thinking about it. If every single one of our desires are not determined, then God does not determine all things that come to pass. And so God doesn't only determine the desire to kill, but the weapon that will be used.
He's got a knife.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
There are no murderers having rogue desires to murder with knives when God has decreed that they would murder with a gun, for example. And if God determines my desires to ignore the needy, doesn't that make God responsible? Doesn't God determine all things that come to pass? I think we ought to be very cautious entertaining the notion that God determines our desires. Because if He determines our very desires, then He determines our desires to sin, even as believers, to turn away from those who are in need, our lack of desire to read our Bible, to pray, to love our neighbor as ourselves. That philosophical worldview is a very slippery slope. And honestly, I can say during my time as a Calvinist that philosophical worldview fueled my spiritual laziness. There are other theologians and biblical scholars who have very robust alternatives to Calvinism. What I realize now, 90% of what I knew about the alternative view was from Calvinistic sources.
Information can come from many different sources and perspectives. But when you're only hearing the same perspectives and opinions over and over again, you may be in something called an echo chamber. An echo chamber is an environment where a person only encounters information or opinions that reflect and reinforce their own.
And most of the time, at least most of the leading Calvinists that I listened to and read, strawman their opponents. And so I would just encourage you to take a fresh look at the scriptures. If you cannot accurately represent your opponent's view, how are we even qualified to make a decision on what we really believe about the Bible?